Hello and welcome to Talking Tolkien, and the first part in the series of Frodo's journey. In these videos I'll replicate the journey of Frodo Baggins from his initial departure from the Shire throughout the events of The Lord of the Rings, using the detailed game world of Lord of the Rings Online, as well as reading relevant passages directly from J.R.R. Tolkien's work. I hope you enjoy sharing the journey with me. So, according to the tale, Frodo's initial plan, as discussed with Gandalf, was that he, along with his servant Sam Gamgee, would take the One Ring to Rivendell, where they would then look for advice from Lord Elrond and the elves before deciding what to do with it. In order to reduce suspicion and curiosity in Hobbiton, Frodo had arranged to buy a house in Crickhollow, in Buckland, on the eastern edge of the Shire. Sam and Pippin would accompany Frodo as they travelled through the Shire, while Merry had left a couple of days earlier to warm the house before you arrive. Gandalf had assured Frodo that he too would be accompanying the hobbits on their journey, but as of dusk on the 23rd of September, there was still no sign of the wizard. So here's Bag End, which has mostly been packed away by now, so this is how it would have looked on 23rd of September, when Frodo would have spent his last day here, before Lobelia Sackville Baggins moved in. The sun went down. Bag End seemed sad and gloomy and dishevelled. Frodo wandered round the familiar rooms and saw the light of the sunset fade on the walls, and shadows creep out of the corners. It grew slowly dark indoors. Pippin was sitting on his pack in the porch. Sam was not there. Frodo stepped inside the dark door. "Sam," he called. "Sam! Time!" "Coming, sir," came the answer from far within, followed soon by Sam himself, wiping his mouth. He'd been saying farewell to the beer barrel in the cellar. "All aboard, Sam?" said Frodo. "Yes, sir, I'll last for a bit now, sir." Frodo shut and locked the round door and gave the key to Sam. "Run down with this to your home, Sam," he said. "Then cut along the row and meet us as quick as you can at the gate in the lane beyond the meadows. We're not going through the village tonight. Too many ears pricking and eyes prying." Sam ran off at full speed. "Well, now we're off at last," said Frodo. They shouldered their packs and took up their sticks and walked round the corner to the west side of Bag End. "Goodbye," said Frodo, looking at the dark, blank windows. He waved his hand and then turned and, following Bilbo if he had known it, hurried after Peregrine down the garden path. They jumped over the low place in the hedge at the bottom and took to the fields, passing into the darkness like a rustle in the grasses. They went in single file along hedgerows and the borders of coppices, and the night fell dark about them. In their dark cloaks they were as invisible as if they all had magic rings. Since they were all hobbits and were trying to be silent, they made no noise that even hobbits would hear. Even the wild things in the fields and woods hardly noticed their passing. After some time, they crossed the water west of Hobbiton by a narrow plank bridge. The stream was there no more than a winding black ribbon bordered with leaning alder trees. So while we have a little bit of quiet time as the hobbits hike over the peaceful countryside, it's worth taking a moment to discuss the issue of scale, as it's something which will come up quite often over this series. Now, in Tolkien's book, the Shire would take about 3 days to cross. Indeed, that's how long it takes Frodo to travel through it in The Lord of the Rings. Obviously, the challenge for a game depicting that world is to ensure the right balance is struck between having interesting things to do, and not just mile after mile of nondescript countryside to walk through, and having everything packed on top of each other so that there's no sense of distance at all. Overall, I think as these videos will show, The Lord of the Rings Online strikes this balance quite well. But it's worth remembering that some days will seem a lot shorter than others, and that's just how the game spreads villages and other landmarks out. I'll try and show in the description of each video how long Frodo travelled for on each day, and at the end of each video I'll show a map with the approximate route he took in the game world. So we've got something to look forward to. The hobbits had been travelling for about 3 hours when they decided to stop for a little bit of food, and that would have been around here. Not exactly sure where, but yeah, somewhere around here. Anyway, we'll keep on marching through the night. A mile or two further south, they hastily crossed the great road from the Brandywine Bridge. They were now in the Tuckland, and bending southeastwards, they made for the green hill country. When they had walked for about 3 hours, they rested. They ate a very frugal supper for hobbits, and then went on again. So we are entering Tuckland here. In the book, Frodo doesn't actually travel through the village, but because of the game needing to compress some of the settlements, there's not as much open space between them as there was in Tolkien's story. So we'll just duck down under this bridge and it'll be as if we were never here. Soon they struck a narrow road that went rolling up and down, fading grey into the darkness ahead, the road to Woodhall and Stock and the Bucklebury Ferry. It climbed away from the main road in the Water Valley and wound over the skirts of the green hills towards Woody End, a wild corner of the East Farthing. After a while they plunged into a deeply cloven track between tall trees that rustled their dry leaves in the night. It was very dark. At first they talked or hummed a tune softly together, being now far away from inquisitive ears. Then they marched on in silence, and Pippin began to lag behind. At last, as they began to climb a steep slope, he stopped and yawned. "I'm so sleepy," he said, "that soon I shall fall down on the road. Are you going to sleep on your legs? It's nearly midnight." "I thought you liked walking in the dark," said Frodo, "but there is no great hurry. Merry expects us sometime the day after tomorrow, but that leaves us nearly 2 days more. We'll halt at the first likely spot." Just over the top of the hill they came on the patch of firwood. Now, normally in the game there are foxes around, but when you get close to them they run away, and you can even kill them if you really want to. But at this point there is a fox which, uniquely, doesn't run away and can't be killed. So this must mark where the hobbits slept on their first night, as this passage from the book alludes to. A fox passing through woods on business of his own stopped several minutes and sniffed. "Hobbits?" he thought. "Well, what next? I've heard of strange doings in this land, but I've seldom heard of a hobbit sleeping out of doors under a tree. 3 of them? There's something mighty queer behind this." He was quite right, but he never found out any more about it. Leaving the road, they went into the deep resin-scented darkness of the trees, and gathered dead sticks and cones to make a fire. Soon they had a merry crackle of flame at the foot of a large fir tree, and they sat round it for a while until they began to nod. Then, each in an angle of the great tree's roots, they curled up in their cloaks and blankets, and were soon fast asleep. The morning came, pale and clammy. Frodo woke up first, and found that a tree root had made a hole in his back, and that his neck was stiff. When their breakfast was over, and their packs all trussed up again, it was after 10 o'clock, and the day was beginning to turn fine and hot. They went down the slope, and across the stream where it dived under the road, and up the next slope, and up and down another shoulder of the hills. And by that time their cloaks, blankets, water, food, and other gear already seemed a heavy burden. The day's march promised to be warm and tiring work. After some miles, however, The road ceased to roll up and down. It climbed to the top of a steep bank in a weary, zigzagging sort of way, and then prepared to go down for the last time. In front of them they saw the lower lands dotted with small clumps of trees that melted away in the distance to a brown woodland haze. They were looking across the woody end towards the Brandywine River. The road wound away before them like a piece of string. Frodo spoke a rhyme at this point, which we can hear Tolkien himself read.
The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow it, if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say.
The sun was beginning to get low, and the light of afternoon was on the land as they went down the hill. So far they had not met a soul on the road. This way was not much used, being hardly fit for carts, and there was little traffic to the woody end. They had been jogging along again for an hour or more when Sam stopped a moment as if listening. They were now on level ground, and the road, after much winding, lay straight ahead through grassland sprinkled with tall trees, outliers of the approaching woods. It was here that the hobbits heard a rider coming. They hid themselves off the main track and realised it was a black rider. They continued on with more caution. By now the sun was beginning to set, and it was around here that the hobbits encountered a group of high elves, led by Gildor and Glorian, heading to the Grey Havens. Gildor invited Frodo to travel the remainder of the day with them, and they camped together on the hills above Woodhall, which is here. In the morning Frodo woke refreshed. He was lying in a bower made by a living tree with branches laced and drooping to the ground. His bed was of fern and grass, deep and soft and strangely fragrant. The sun was shining through the fluttering leaves which were still green upon the tree. He jumped up and went out. Sam was sitting on the grass near the edge of the wood. Pippin was standing, studying the sky and weather. There was no sign of the elves. It was already nearly as hot as it had been the day before, but clouds were beginning to come up from the west. It looked likely to turn to rain. The hobbits scrambled down a steep green bank and plunged into the thick trees below. Their course had been chosen to leave Woodhall to their left and to cut slanting through the woods that clustered along the eastern side of the hills until they reached the flats beyond. Then they could make straight for the ferry over country that was open except for a few ditches and fences. Frodo reckoned they had 18 miles to go in a straight line. So this is where they decide to take a shortcut to mushrooms and head off the path they had been following. While trying to take a shortcut, the hobbits ended up getting lost before eventually coming to a farm. Let's creep past this mean-looking scarecrow. And here we arrive at Bamfurlong, Farmer Maggot's farm. If you're wondering what's in these large tents, we can see they contain mushrooms, of course. Yes, Farmer Maggot is really into his mushrooms. Here we can see Farmer Maggot with his son, Hammy Maggot, as well as his 3 dogs, Grip, Fang and Wolf. The hobbits stay here for a time and catch up with Farmer Maggot and eat their evening meal. By the time they're ready to leave, it's getting dark, and they're still concerned about the threat of black riders pursuing them. So Farmer Maggot offers to take them up on his cart to the nearby Bucklebury Ferry, where they can cross the river and reach their destination. It was 5 miles or more from Maggot's Lane to the ferry. The hobbits wrapped themselves up, but their ears were strained for any sound above the creak of the wheels and the slow clop of the pony's hooves. The wagon seemed slower than a snail to Frodo. Beside him, Pippin was nodding towards sleep, but Sam was staring forwards into the rising fog. They reached the entrance to the Ferry Lane at last. It was marked by two tall white posts that suddenly loomed up on their right. Farmer Maggot drew in his ponies and the wagon creaked to a halt. As they arrived at the ferry, they met Merry Brandybuck and said goodbye to Farmer Maggot. The Brandywine River flowed slow and broad before them. On the other side the bank was steep, and up it a winding path climbed from the further landing. Lamps were twinkling there. Behind loomed up the Buck Hill, and out of it, through stray shrouds of mist, shone many round windows, yellow and red. They were the windows of Brandy Hall, the ancient home of the Brandybucks. It was some distance from the Brandywine to Frodo's new house at Crickhollow. They passed Buck Hill and Brandy Hall on their left, and on the outskirts of Bucklebury struck the main road of Buckland that ran south from the bridge. Half a mile northward along this they came to a lane opening on their right. This they followed for a couple of miles as it climbed up and down into the country. Brandy Hall sits in the middle of Buckland where we are now. Here's a little bit of Buckland history. Long ago, Gorhendad Oldbuck, head of the Oldbuck family, one of the oldest in the Marish, or indeed in the Shire, had crossed the river, which was the original boundary of the land eastward. He built and excavated Brandy Hall, changed his name to Brandybuck, and settled down to become master of what was virtually a small, independent country. His family grew and grew, and after his days continued to grow, until Brandy Hall occupied the whole of the low hill and had 3 large front doors, many side doors, and about 100 windows. At last they came to a narrow gate in a thick hedge. Nothing could be seen of the house in the dark. It stood back from the lane in the middle of a wide circle of lawn surrounded by a belt of low trees inside the outer hedge. Frodo had chosen it because it stood in an out-of-the-way corner of the country, and there were no other dwellings close by. You could get in and out without being noticed. It had been built a long while before by the Brandybucks for the use of guests or members of the family that wished to escape from the crowded life of Brandy Hall for a time. It was an old-fashioned countrified house, as much like a hobbit hole as possible. It was long and low, with no upper story, and it had a roof of turf, round windows, and a large round door. As they walked up the green path from the gate, no light was visible. The windows were dark and shuttered. Frodo knocked on the door, and Fatty Bolger opened it. A friendly light streamed out. They slipped in quickly and shut themselves and the light inside. So now here's a look at the in-game map for the Shire. Day 1 is coloured red, Day 2 is blue, and Day 3 is green. This shows approximately the journey the hobbits have completed, though as they got lost on Day 3 it's hard to be accurate, but it gives you an idea. Also, it looks like they didn't cover much distance on Day 2, and as mentioned earlier, the reason for that is because of the way the game scales the map. If we compare this to Tolkien's original map of the Shire, shown here, we can see the distances were much more accurate. So, hopefully you've enjoyed joining Frodo on this part of his journey. If you have, please do subscribe to my channel, Talking Tolkien, and share the video, which will motivate me to continue creating these episodes as Frodo continues his journey towards Rivendell and beyond. Once again, thank you for watching Talking Tolkien.